I evicted my parents on a Tuesday morning, right after the coffee finished dripping. The house was quiet. Too quiet for a place that had once been full of slammed doors, raised voices, and the constant hum of my mother's television playing game shows she never actually watched. I stood at the kitchen counter, holding a folded legal notice in my hand, my thumb rubbing the crease over and over like I could soften it through friction. When I finally looked up, my father's face had gone pale in a way I'd only seen once before, at my grandfather's funeral. My mother didn't go pale. She went still. Her mouth stayed open, just slightly, as if she'd been interrupted mid-sentence and never recovered. "You can't be serious," she said finally. "I am," I replied. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. It sounded calm. Final. That moment didn't begin on a Tuesday. It began decades earlier in a house where love was rationed and money was used like a measuring stick to decide who mattered. I was the second child. That detail alone seemed to decide everything. My older brother Daniel was what my mother liked to call a blessing. She said it with a hand pressed to her chest, eyes shining, like she was talking about a miracle that had personally chosen her. Daniel was athletic, loud, effortlessly charming. Teachers loved him. Coaches adored him. My parents orbited around his achievements like planets around a sun. I was practical. That was the word they used for me. Not gifted, not special. Practical. I learned early that practical children didn't need new shoes unless the soles were actually flapping. Practical children didn't need music lessons or summer camps. Practical children were expected to understand. At dinner, my father would carve the chicken and slide the bigger piece onto Daniel's plate without thinking. When report cards came home, Daniel's B- in math earned a congratulatory clap on the shoulder. My straight A's were met with a distracted nod. "That's nice," my mother would say, already turning back to Daniel. "Did you tell them about the goal you scored?" Money was where the difference became undeniable. When Daniel turned 16, my parents bought him a used car. Not fancy, but reliable. I remember standing in the driveway, the smell of oil and hot metal thick in the air, watching my father toss him the keys. "Don't scratch it," he joked. I smiled too, because that was what I did. I smiled and swallowed things. When I turned 16, I got a bus pass. My mother handed it to me across the kitchen table like it was a favor. "This is more practical for you," she said. "You don't really go anywhere anyway." By the time college came around, the pattern was so established it barely registered as pain anymore. Just a dull, constant pressure. My parents sat me down one evening, my mother's hands folded neatly, my father staring at a spot on the wall behind me. "We've decided to help Daniel with his tuition," my father said. "Med school isn't cheap." I nodded. "Okay." My mother hesitated, then added, "You're smart. You'll figure something out." And I did. Scholarships, part-time jobs, late nights. I worked in the library, in a cafe, as a tutor. I learned how to stretch a dollar until it almost snapped. Daniel, meanwhile, complained about how hard residency was while my parents quietly paid his rent. Every holiday came with gifts that told the same story. Daniel unwrapped electronics, watches, things that required warranties. I got sweaters, scarves, useful things. Once, when I was 23, I asked my mother if they could help me with a security deposit for an apartment closer to work. I rehearsed the question all day, my stomach tight. She frowned like I'd asked for something unreasonable. "We just don't have the extra money," she said. That same week, Daniel posted photos from a ski trip my parents had helped fund. I stared at my phone, the cold blue light reflecting back at me, and felt something inside me harden. Still, I stayed. I showed up. I helped when they needed it. When my parents struggled with their mortgage years later, it was me they called. not Daniel. I sat at their dining table, the wood worn smooth from decades of meals, while my father slid papers toward me with hands that trembled just slightly. "We're just a little behind," he said, "just until things settle." I looked at the numbers. I looked at their faces. I said yes. That was how it started, me helping temporarily, covering a payment here, fixing a leak there. Eventually, it made sense for me to move back in, to keep an eye on things. My parents framed it as generosity on their part, letting me live there at a reduced cost. The truth was quieter. My money kept the house standing. Over time, without ceremony or announcement, the house became legally mine. It was cleaner that way, the lawyer said. Safer. I paid. I signed. My parents nodded along, barely listening. "Of course," my mother said. "You're good with that stuff." They continued living there, just as they always had. I didn't correct anyone who assumed it was still their house. It didn't feel necessary. They were my parents. I wasn't keeping score. Or so I told myself. Daniel visited occasionally, sweeping in with expensive cologne and loud laughter, complaining about parking, about traffic, about how exhausting his life was. He never asked how the house was paid for. He never asked how I was doing. Then my body started to fail me. It began as pain, sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. Doctor visits turned into tests. Tests turned into long, careful conversations where physicians chose their words like stepping stones. Surgery, they said. Soon. I sat alone in my car after one of those appointments, hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel, the world outside blurred. I knew what the surgery would cost. I knew what recovery would mean. I also knew, with a sinking certainty, that I would need help. That night, I sat across from my parents at the same dining table where I'd signed my name so many times. The overhead light cast shadows under my mother's eyes, along the deep lines in my father's face. "I need to talk to you about something," I said. They looked up, attentive in a way that felt unfamiliar. I took a breath. And that was where everything was about to change. My mother didn't interrupt while I explained the surgery. That alone felt strange. I told them where the pain started, how it spread, how I'd learned to hide it during work meetings by pressing my fingernails into my palm. I explained the recovery time, the weeks I wouldn't be able to lift anything heavier than a grocery bag. I even showed them the printed estimate from the hospital, the numbers highlighted in yellow like that made them less frightening. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. My mother's lips pressed into a thin, thoughtful line. "So," she said finally, "what exactly are you asking?" The words landed harder than I expected. "I'm asking for help," I said. "Just for a little while. The surgery is covered mostly, but the rest? I can't do it alone. Not right now." There it was. Plain, honest, exposed. My mother exchanged a look with my father. It was quick, practiced, a silent language they'd perfected over decades. "Well," my father said slowly, "we've been talking." My stomach tightened. My mother sighed. Like this conversation was an inconvenience she'd hoped to avoid. "You know we'd help if we could, but things are complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked. She gestured vaguely around the room. The house, the furniture, the walls I had paid for. "We're on a fixed income," she said, "and Daniel's situation is delicate right now." I blinked. "Daniel?" "He's opening a private practice," my father said. "There are startup costs." The room seemed to tilt slightly, like I'd stood up too fast. "I'm having surgery," I said. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. "I'm talking about medical bills." "Yes, but Daniel's future," my mother began, "is apparently more important than my present," I finished. Her eyes hardened. That's not fair. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. Isn't it? My father cleared his throat. You've always been independent. You're strong. You'll manage. I stared at him, searching his face for something. Regret, maybe, or discomfort. I found neither. Just relief. Relief that he didn't have to step up. So that's it, I said quietly. You won't help. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, a gesture so familiar it almost hurt more than her words. You'll understand someday. I pulled my hand back. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes ticking, the refrigerator humming. Every sound felt amplified, like the walls themselves were paying attention. I thought about all the checks I'd written, all the quiet sacrifices I'd made without ever asking for recognition. I thought about how easily they'd said no. The surgery date was set anyway. I adjusted. I always did. I borrowed. I negotiated payment plans. I sold things I didn't need. Friends stepped in where family wouldn't. My parents drove me to the hospital the morning of the surgery. My mother fussed over my collar, straightening it like I was a child again. My father complained about the parking. Call us when you're done, my mother said, already glancing at her phone. I watched them walk away, their backs familiar, unremarkable. I told myself not to expect anything else. Recovery was harder than I admitted to anyone. Pain has a way of shrinking the world down to its essentials. Some days, the only thing I accomplished was getting from the bed to the couch. Bills piled up on the counter, unopened. I moved slowly, carefully, like my body was made of glass. My parents checked in occasionally. A text. A call that lasted just long enough to say they'd done their duty. Then, one afternoon, my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table, her purse clutched in her lap. We need to talk about the house, she said. I felt a flicker of unease. What about it? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Daniel's been asking questions. My heart skipped. Questions about what? Well, she said, choosing her words carefully, about ownership, about the future. I stared at her. The future? My father joined us, standing rather than sitting. That, too, felt deliberate. We think it's time to make things official, he said, to keep things fair. Fair. The word echoed in my head. What does that mean? I asked. My mother opened her purse and pulled out a folder. Thick, neatly organized. We've decided, she said, that the house should stay in the family. It is in the family, I said. It's mine. Her smile tightened. On paper, maybe, but morally. We want Daniel to have a stake, my father interrupted. He's always assumed. Assumed what? I asked, my pulse pounding. That this would be his inheritance, my mother said gently. It wouldn't be right to take that away from him. I looked at the folder. At the corner of a document peeking out, my name printed in a font I recognized all too well. You want me to give him my house? I said slowly. Not give, my father corrected. Share. I felt dizzy. I paid for it. My mother waved a hand. Details. Families don't keep score. I laughed, a sound that scraped my throat. You kept score when I needed surgery. Her expression shifted, something sharp flashing across her face. That's not the same thing, isn't it? I asked. She leaned forward. Daniel needs stability. And frankly, you don't have children. You don't need all this space. I stared at her, every word etching itself into me. That was the moment. Not the refusal. Not the excuses. It was the certainty with which she assumed I would comply, that I would sacrifice. Again. And as I looked at the papers in her hand, I realized this wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan they'd been making for a long time. I didn't answer them right away. I remember my mother watching my face closely, like she was waiting for the familiar version of me to show up, the one who nodded, the one who swallowed discomfort whole and called it maturity. My father shifted his weight, already impatient, as if my silence was a minor inconvenience delaying an outcome he considered inevitable. I need time, I said finally. My mother exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. Of course. Take a few days. They left the folder on the table. That night, long after the house went quiet, I sat alone under the kitchen light and opened it. Inside were documents I hadn't seen before. Drafts, copies, notes in my mother's handwriting in the margins. There was a proposed transfer agreement, unfinished, unsigned, outlining how ownership of the house would be restructured to include Daniel. My name appeared again and again, not as an owner, but as a consenting party, a formality, a box to be checked. I turned each page slowly, my fingers steady despite the heat building behind my eyes. At the bottom of one page was a sticky note, yellowed slightly at the edges. Once OP agrees, we can move quickly. My chest tightened. I gathered the papers back into the folder and closed it, my hands resting on top like I could hold everything in place by sheer will. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the house settling around me. Then I started looking for answers. Over the next few days, I moved carefully, quietly. I waited until my parents were out. Errands, lunches, church. And I searched through filing cabinets, desk drawers, old boxes in the closet. I told myself I was just trying to understand, that I wasn't expecting to find anything new. I was wrong. In a small fireproof box tucked behind old tax returns, I found a sealed envelope with my father's handwriting on the front. My name, misspelled, the way he always spelled it wrong on birthday cards. Inside was a copy of a will. Not the will I'd known about. Not the vague verbal assurances they'd always made about splitting things fairly someday. This one was dated months earlier. I read it once. Then again, slower. The house, my house, was listed as an asset of my parents' estate, left entirely to Daniel. There was a clause acknowledging my financial contributions, not repayment, not ownership, a gesture of gratitude. A small fixed sum that wouldn't have covered even a year of the mortgage payments I'd made. My hand started to shake then. At the bottom was a signature, my father's, my mother's, and a witness, a lawyer I recognized. I sat down on the floor, my back against the cabinet, the cool tile seeping through my clothes. I felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life unravel from a safe distance. It wasn't just betrayal. It was planning. They hadn't just refused to help me when I needed surgery. They had been actively preparing to take from me while I was at my weakest. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I became very quiet. I answered questions with short, polite responses. I smiled when expected. I moved through the house like a guest, careful not to disturb anything. My mother noticed, of course. "You seem tired," she said one morning, watching me over the rim of her coffee mug. "I am," I replied. That wasn't a lie. Behind the scenes, I started making calls. I contacted my own lawyer first. I brought copies of everything: the purchase agreements, bank statements, proof of payments, the will. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with every document. "You have a very strong case," he said finally. "But you should know, this will get messy." I thought of my parents' faces at the kitchen table, of the certainty in my mother's voice, of how easily they'd dismissed my pain. "I know," I said. "I'm prepared." Next, I spoke to the hospital's billing department. I renegotiated again, documenting every conversation. I recorded calls when legally allowed. I kept everything: dates, times, names. And then, almost by accident, I found the recording. It was on my father's old tablet, the one he'd asked me to fix because it was running slow. I was clearing out unused apps when I saw a voice memo file. The title was a date: recent. I hesitated. Then I tapped it. My mother's voice filled the room, crisp and unmistakable. Once everything's transferred, it won't matter what she says. The paperwork will already be done. My father laughed softly. She won't fight it. She never does. There was a pause, papers shuffling. And the surgery? My father asked. My mother snorted. She'll figure it out. She always does. Honestly, this might teach her not to rely on us. I stopped the recording, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. There it was. Undeniable, clear, cruel. I sat there for a long time, the tablet heavy in my hands. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak, but my mind was sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. I didn't cry. Not then. I backed up the file, twice. I emailed it to myself. I stored copies in places they couldn't access. Then I waited. I let my parents believe their plan was working. I let my mother talk about family unity, and my father complain about paperwork delays. I nodded when Daniel called to chat, his voice easy, oblivious. Inside, something had shifted. I wasn't angry all the time. I was focused. Justice, I was learning, didn't come from shouting. It came from patience. And when the moment came, I wanted witnesses. I wanted nowhere for them to hide. The opportunity came disguised as a celebration. My mother suggested it, actually. A family dinner. Sunday afternoon. Daniel would be there with his wife. A few relatives. Nothing fancy. Just everyone together, as she put it. Her voice warm and almost cheerful. It's been too long, she said. After everything you've been through, we should all sit down like a family. I agreed immediately. She sounded relieved. I imagine she took my calm acceptance as surrender. The dining room looked the same as it always had. Polished table, matching chairs, the faint smell of lemon cleaner. My mother had set out her good plates, the ones reserved for holidays and guests who mattered. Daniel arrived late, as usual, breezing in with apologies and a crooked smile. He hugged my parents, barely touched my shoulder. You look better, he said to me, distracted. All healed up? Not quite, I replied, but I will be. He nodded, already turning away. We ate. Small talk drifted across the table. Weather, work, Daniel's practice. My parents beamed when he spoke, leaning in, hanging on every word. I watched them quietly, noticing details I'd never let myself focus on before. How my mother mirrored Daniel's expressions, how my father laughed louder at his jokes. When the plates were cleared and coffee poured, my mother clasped her hands together. There's something we should discuss, she said, looking at me. As a family. Every face turned my way. I set my cup down carefully. Actually, I said, I was hoping we could talk about it openly, since everyone's here. My father frowned. Talk about what? The house, I said. The word landed heavily. Daniel blinked. What about it? I stood and walked to the sideboard, where I'd placed a neat stack of folders earlier that day. My heart was beating fast, but my hands were steady. I've been doing some thinking, I said, and some reviewing. I slid the first document across the table toward Daniel. What's this? He asked, flipping it open. His expression changed as he read. Confusion first, then surprise. That's your name, he said, looking up at my parents. Yes, I said, because I bought the house. I paid the mortgage, every payment, for years. My mother's smile faltered. We've talked about this. It's not about money. Let me finish, I said gently. I passed around copies of the bank statements, the contracts, the ownership records. The room grew quieter with each page. Then I placed the will on the table. My father went rigid. This, I said, tapping it lightly, was new to me. Daniel's eyes widened as he skimmed it. You told me it was split evenly, he said, looking at my parents. My mother opened her mouth, closed it again. And this, I continued, taking out my phone, was especially enlightening. I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room. Once everything's transferred, it won't matter what she says. Her face drained of color. My father half rose from his chair. Turn that off. I didn't. She won't fight it. She never does. Daniel stared at them, disbelief written plainly across his face. You recorded us? My mother whispered. No, I said. You recorded yourselves. The recording ended. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left behind. My father's hands trembled. You had no right. I had every right, I said quietly. It's my house, my money, my life you were discussing. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly, his voice unsteady. You let me believe this was already mine? My mother reached for him. We were just trying to protect you. By stealing from her? He shot back, gesturing toward me. For the first time, I saw something like shame cross my father's face. I took a breath. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to be clear. I slid one final paper across the table. This is a formal notice, I said. You have 30 days to vacate the property. My mother stared at it like it was written in another language. You wouldn't. I am, I said. My father sank back into his chair. After everything we've done for you? I met his eyes. You mean, after everything I've done for you? Daniel stood. I didn't know, he said, looking at me. And for once, I believed him. I know, I replied. The room felt different then, like something had finally broken that couldn't be put back together. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The truth sat between us, undeniable and exposed. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking under it. They didn't leave all at once. For the first few days after the dinner, the house felt like it was holding its breath. My parents moved carefully, like guests who knew they'd overstayed but didn't yet know where to go. Drawers opened softly. Doors closed without slamming. My mother avoided my eyes. My father stopped speaking to me entirely. Daniel called the next morning. I didn't know, he said again, quieter this time. I swear. I know, I told him, and I meant it. There was a long pause on the line. They crossed a line. Yes, I said. They did. He didn't defend them. That mattered more than an apology. The legal part moved faster than I expected. Once the evidence was laid out, documents, recordings, timelines, there was very little room for argument. My parents' lawyer withdrew within a week. The will was amended under pressure they could no longer deny. Every attempt they made to frame themselves as misunderstood parents collapsed under the weight of their own planning. Word spread, quietly at first, then louder. Relatives called, some awkwardly, some with thinly veiled curiosity. A few apologized for things they'd never questioned. Others didn't call at all. I stopped trying to manage their reactions. That wasn't my job anymore. The day my parents moved out, my mother stood in the doorway for a long time. She looked smaller somehow, her coat hanging loose on her shoulders. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I never thought you'd do this, she said. I didn't argue. I know. My father loaded the last box into the car without looking back. When the engine started, the sound echoed down the street, sharp and final. I watched until the car disappeared, then closed the door. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not tense, not heavy, honest. In the weeks that followed, I finished healing. Slowly, deliberately. I attended follow-up appointments without the constant knot of dread in my stomach. I slept better. I breathed deeper. It turned out that carrying the truth openly was lighter than carrying years of quiet compliance. I repainted the dining room, got rid of the heavy table, bought plants that needed sunlight and care. I made the space mine in ways I'd never allowed myself to before. Daniel visited once, alone. He stood in the doorway, taking in the changes. "I should have asked more questions," he said. "Maybe," I replied, "but that wasn't your responsibility either." He nodded. "I don't know what happens with them now." "That's between you and them," I said gently. "It's not something I can carry anymore." He hugged me before he left. It was awkward, real, new. My parents sent one letter. Not an apology. Not really. More an explanation. Heavy on intention, light on accountability. I read it once, then filed it away. I didn't need it to define the ending. Justice didn't look like shouting or tears or watching them suffer. It looked like boundaries. It looked like the truth spoken out loud. It looked like choosing myself without guilt. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that Tuesday morning. The coffee, the paper in my hand, the look on their faces. Not with bitterness, with clarity. Because that was the moment I stopped being the practical child who understood and became the adult who decided.